So our Torah portion today is called Shelach. It means to be sent out, so to speak. And it's taken from Numbers, or Bamidbar, Numbers chapter 13, verse 1, goes over to verse 41 of chapter 15. And it begins by saying, Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, everyone a leader among them. That's an important thing there. They weren't just some random guys. They were leaders among their people. And so Moses sent them from the wilderness of Paran according to the command of the Lord, all of them men who were heads of the children of Israel. Now, it is believed that this particular event that's about to transpire occurred about 2 years after Israel had left Egypt, which means just 2 years into their journey, they were already spying out the land with the prospects of going in to subdue the land. In other words, they were just about to enter into their destiny, what God had intended for them. And then that's when disaster struck. And so with this portion and the portion that comes next week, Korah, that bad word, and all the things that it conveys, we're entering into a section of the scripture that focuses on issues that, it might feel a little awkward to talk about and to discuss because we talk about them every year. And every year I have people say, why do you keep talking about that? Well, the reason I keep talking about it is because God keeps talking about it. So he has his reasons. And so we have to address these things at times that are a little bit awkward and uncomfortable. But we do that because these are issues that have historically arisen when you get a bunch of people together, right? That wasn't a trick question. It happens, right? Things like unbelief, rebellion, murmuring, these kinds of things. And so I don't see how we can read and discuss these portions and ignore these particular issues. And now, for that matter, I'm not going to read a lot of it today. I think it's probably very familiar to most of you. What happens in the story with the spies go in, they spy out the land, they come back with the evil report, the people believe the evil report, and the consequences of that. So it should be familiar to most of you. But I do want to discuss some of the issues that are present in this Torah portion that are relevant to our situation here at this congregation in the time in which we live, and to address these things that are bound to happen and surface from time to time in a congregational setting. And in discussing them, I want to consider how these things come to be, how these things arise, what provokes them. And when I'm reading the Torah portion again this morning, thinking about it, it seems to me that the things that transpired in this particular Torah portion, if I boil them down, it seems to me that their mistakes was due to their perception and not necessarily their reality. For instance, when they saw the giants, they saw themselves as grasshoppers. Then they willingly listened to an evil report. In other words, again, their perception was not necessarily their reality. But because of their perception, they opened their ears to an evil report. And as they opened their ears to an evil report, they stopped their ears when they heard the truth. And then when they did that, they opened their mouths when they should have kept their mouths shut and started saying things that were not so. For instance, Numbers 13, verse 31, we are not able to go up against this people, for they are stronger than we. They said that in spite of the fact that God said, I will go before you. You don't have to fear them. You don't have to dread them. They said that in spite of the fact that they were staring at the fruit of the land that provided the evidence that what God had said them at the very beginning of this journey was absolutely true. In fact, by their own admission, the spies said, it truly flows with milk and honey, just like Moses said. And here's the fruit, look at it. But nevertheless, their perception, they allowed to become what they thought was their reality. And they said things that were not so. And so their reaction, I want to emphasize that word, their reaction to what they saw, as opposed to a response. And I think there's a big difference. Some people react some people respond. And it is my opinion that people who react typically do it just like that, without thinking, without contemplating, without considering. They just, and when those words are out of your mouth, it's like a feather pillow that you've ripped open. You can try as much as you want to get all those feathers back in there, but the wind is going to come and blow some this way. There's always going to be feathers floating out there, right? That's an amen, just in case you want to, that's absolutely true. So as opposed to responding, they reacted to what they saw. And their reaction to what they saw was bound to their senses. All 5 of our senses are connected to our head. Even touch, because with touch, the nerves send a signal to the brain, right? So all 5 of our senses are connected to our head, not to our heart necessarily, which I think is very important. Not necessarily connected to our spirit, to our mind, our consciousness, that soulish part of us, which also hints at our intellect. What makes sense to me? What it seems logical to me. Because when something doesn't jive with our intellect, we tend to doubt. We're uncertain, and doubt can lead to unbelief. And so in short, these senses can get us in trouble depending on the condition of our heart. And so that's why we're told the first and greatest command is to love the Lord your God with all of your heart first and foremost. Then your mind, your strength follows after that. So then when we rely too heavily, and God gives us senses for a reason. They serve a purpose, don't get me wrong. But if we rely too heavily on our senses to the point that we allow them to override what God has spoken to our heart and spirit, then we might see things that really didn't happen. Our eyes perceive things one way, when in reality it might be something else. A traffic accident, 10 people see it. I guarantee you that several of those people will have seen something a little different than the next one. And really, the guy who gets the most, or gets a clearer picture of what actually happened is the traffic cop who shows up later to listen to what all the witnesses have to say. Because in an instant, we form an image in our mind. So my point is, our eyes sometimes will perceive things one way when in reality it was something else. Again, they perceived the giants and the fortified cities as impenetrable obstacles. That's how they defined it. That was their reality based on their perception. That's what they saw. I want you to consider this also. Sometimes our memory will fail us. We thought we saw this, and our memory starts to fade, or what we heard, and our memory starts to fade. And you know what we do? We fill in the blanks with what we think was said, or what we think we saw, or what we think happened. We start to fill in the gaps with what we think happened, which kind of brings us to the place of having this mythological version of history. Here's the problem with that particular scenario. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 3. For the time will come when they, and the they is not talking about the world, the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires, because they have itching ears, they will heap up for themselves teachers, and they will turn their ears away from the truth and be turned aside to fables, myths. In other words, things that never really happened, things that just aren't so. And so I'm going to suggest to you that this is, in effect, what Paul warns Timothy about. This is, in effect, what the congregation of Israel did when they believed the evil report. They could not endure what God had called them to do. Go into the land. I'm going to go before you. Overcome. They couldn't endure that. So they couldn't endure sound doctrine, if you will. They had their own agenda. They were constantly wanting to go back to Egypt. So they had what they wanted to do in conflict with what God had called them to do. And so consequently, when they got this evil report from the 10 spies, they turned away from the truth that Moses had spoken to them, They turned away from the truth, even stopped up their ears when Caleb reminded them of what the truth was. But instead, they turned to the 10 spies as their teachers and believed what they had to say. And in the end, they believed what was not true. When we rely too heavily on our senses, allowing them to override what God has spoken to our heart, sometimes we hear things that were never said. That happened on many occasions during Yeshua's earthly ministry. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. John chapter 2, verse 19. Yeshua answered and said to them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Then the Jews said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days." But he was speaking of the temple of his body. Now we know that, but we're looking at it, from this vantage point. But in that moment, you had these people who are well learned in the scripture, probably in some ways knew the scripture better than you and I do right now. But yet, when they heard him say something, they perceived it was this, when in reality it was that. In other words, their perception became their reality, but it was not what was truly being spoken here. And as a matter of fact, this particular exchange is going to come up later at his trial. There's going to be people at his trial who are going to say, this guy said he could destroy this temple and raise it up in 3 days. But they failed to understand what he truly meant. They heard the words he spoke, but they didn't hear what he said. And it was only after his resurrection that even his disciples understood what he meant by that statement. My point, sometimes if we rely too heavily on our senses to the point that we allow them to override what God has spoken to us, we can hear things that were never said. Here's another example, John chapter 6, verse 53. Then Yeshua said to them, "Most assuredly I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day." And when he said that, there were people who just lost their ever-loving minds. Why? Because the life of all flesh is in the blood. Anybody who eats the blood, that's an abomination to God. The Torah says this, that, and the other. They didn't hear what he said, did they? They heard something was not really said. In fact, when they heard this, based on their perception and their senses, their intellect, their understanding of things, here's what it says in verse 60 of John 6. Therefore, many of his disciples, not his opponents, not his adversaries, but his disciples, when they heard this, said, "This is a hard saying. Who can understand it?" Well, obviously they could not, because from that point forward, many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. Let that sink in. Because of their perception of what he said and their misinterpretation of what he said, many of them failed to follow him from that point forward. They walked with him no more. So if these disciples had been called by him and had taken up their cross, so to speak, and were determined to follow him at the beginning, but then later determined to walk with him no more, how are these people different from those who heard and believed the evil report? As a footnote, after this happened, Yeshua turns to the 12 and said, "You going to leave too?" Now I want to interject just some personal thoughts here. I want you to notice Yeshua did not chase these people down to explain to them just what it was he was trying to say. He didn't go run them down and say, hey, you misunderstood. Let's get this. He apparently, all right. They walked off. And he turns to the 12 and says, "Are you going to leave too?" Here's Peter's response. "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. Also, we have come to believe and know that you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Now, recall in Matthew chapter 16, when Yeshua was asking his disciples, "Who do men say that I am?" And they have all these different answers. And then he says, "But who do you say that I am?" It was Peter who stood up and said, "You are the Mashiach and the Son of the living God." And do you remember Yeshua said, blessed are you, Shimon Bar Yonah, because flesh and blood, men did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven, he's the one who's revealed this to you. In other words, Peter heard in his heart and spirit what the Father was saying in regard to the Messiah, and he held on to that, even when maybe he didn't really understand what he meant by these words. He did not allow his senses to override what he knew the Father had spoken to his heart. He heard these things, he believed these things, and so he was led not by his senses, but by the Spirit of God. So here is a good place for us to be reminded that the center of balance in the human being is not in our eye. It's not in our tongue, it's in our ear. So I think that's a very important thing for us to always remember, that the Father designed us in such a way that he placed the center of balance in our ear. Meaning that if something gets in and infects our hearing, we're off balance. And if we are going to be true worshipers, we have to be led by the Spirit and truth. We worship him in spirit and truth. That is to say, in a balanced manner. So I've always found it fascinating and very, very important that the center of balance is in the ear, which is why I believe that Yeshua again and again would say, to him who has an ear, let him hear. Now, we presume that all those people he was speaking to, most of them anyway, except the one that Peter cut off his ear, all of them had these little appendages on the side of their head, which, kind of suggested they could hear words. But what was he saying? Not everybody who hears my words hears what I'm saying. And so it has to go beyond the natural, doesn't it? It has to go beyond the senses, so to speak. And it has to be that we are sensitive to the Spirit of God and what he is saying. Hearing the word within the word. Hearing the message within the message. Would you agree with that? All right? So I want you to consider something else here. Yeshua never said that I can find, he who hath an eye, let him see. I never remember him saying, he who has a tongue, let him flap his gums. I'm waiting to see the sign on that. There it goes. All right. He who has an ear, let him hear. Here's something else to consider. When Yeshua spoke the truth, or for that matter, any of God's chosen who spoke the truth, seems to have always offended people. The truth is an offense, isn't it, to many people? It offends me. Because I know that because there are things that I know that God has told me to do or challenged me to do or left instructions in his word for me to do, and some of them I just don't like. I know that all you spiritual people would never say anything like that. But there are some things he says, do this, and I'm like, I don't really want to do that. There are some things he said, don't do that, but I really do want to do that. It offends me in that regard. The choice I have to make is whether or not I'm going to offend my flesh and say no to it and abide by his word, or I'm going to offend him. The truth offends. And when Yeshua would speak, his commitment to speak what the Father had told him to speak and to do what the Father had told him to do, it created him a lot of enemies. Speaking the truth will create enemies. Now that connects to our portion in this manner. After hearing the spy's report, it says that all the congregation, I think that should have said chapter 14, I'm sorry. That's a mistake on my part. So go to chapter 14, verse 1. So all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. You going to be able to find that? And all the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, if only we had died in the land of Egypt. All right, just let that sink in for just a moment. They heard this report, and they believed it. They've stopped up their ears to the truth, and now I wish we had just died in Egypt. If only we had died in Egypt. Or, if only we had died in this wilderness. Why has the Lord brought us into this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and children should become victims? Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt?" So they said to one another, "Let us select a leader and return to Egypt." Let somebody else look at that map, Moses. What's going on here? So let's select a leader and return to Egypt. Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all of the assembly of the congregation of the children of Israel. But Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, they saw the same things, heard the same things, experienced the same things. They tore their clothes, and they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, "The land we passed through to spy is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. We're going to eat them up." That seems to be what he was saying. "Their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them." And here's how the congregation responded: "Let's stone them with stones. Because when you speak the truth, it makes enemies." It makes enemies for you. Speaking the truth to people who are led by their senses and emotions creates enemies. That's what it did for Joshua and Caleb. They came to be regarded as the enemy of the people simply because they told them the truth. Because as Jack Nicholson once said, you can't handle the truth. Right? Had not the glory of God appeared at that moment, they may have followed through with their threats to stone them. Now, I know that the specific issue that we're addressing here in the Torah portion is different from what Paul was addressing when he was writing to the Galatians, but I believe the principle is the same, because he asked this question in Galatians chapter 4, "Have I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth?" Now, you think about your life and your journey, and let's be honest, sometimes we try to present the truth in order to be viewed as right, and we didn't always do it the right way. I'm not talking about those times. But I am talking about those times when we've tried to live out the way that we feel the Father has called us to do it, and lovingly try to present truth, always with an eye on reconciliation and restoration. When we've done it that way, all right, and that's the scenario that I'm referring to, not the other one. Has that ever made you any enemies? Have you ever taken a stand for what is right, not in, with a belligerent attitude, but with just a resolve that I'm going to do what's right? And has that ever made you an enemy? Proclaiming, living, taking a stand for the truth will create enemies for you. Now, if we're on the other side of that, and we hear the truth and it offends us, we need to be very careful. Because stopping our ears from hearing the truth places us in a very, very precarious situation. In fact, in the Torah portion, we see that when we stop up our ears to the truth, defiantly, in a rebellious way, the Lord has told us, "I want you to go in the land. I'm going to defend you. I'm going to go before you. I'm going to fight for you. But you can't do it. The adversary is too powerful. Besides, I never really wanted to do it in the first place. I wish you would have just left us in Egypt." That was this attitude that was always beneath the surface. But when we stop up our ears from hearing what the Father has to say, the consequences can be deadly. And this is important for you and for me to see, not just that it happened, but that it will happen. This is going to be an issue in the last days. People who do not want to hear the truth. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 9. Paul says this: "The coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan, with all power, signs, and lying wonders, and with all unrighteous deception among those who perish." Why? Because they did not receive the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this reason, because they did not receive the love of the truth, this provokes God to send them strong delusion, that they should believe the lie, that they all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. So I want to summarize this. He's describing people seeing things, maybe hearing things that are intended to deceive and to lure people away from the truth. And because they would not receive the truth, because apparently they had their own agenda, pursuing unrighteousness, then God turns them over to strong delusion, to where they are actually believing that a lie is the truth. Boy, I'm really tempted to say something right here. Well, I don't want to... I want to restrain myself from sounding political, but I watched that debate. There's a Southern term to describe how I viewed some of these people, and especially the talking heads after it was over. And that expression is this: idjit. Raise your hand if you don't know what an idjit is. You don't know what an idjit is? I'll explain it to you later. All right. We have some Northerners here this morning. We'll explain it later. Do you know what an idjit is in California? Okay. All right, but in all seriousness, this passage comes to mind. People who are so determined to reject what is true, and I'm not talking about people now, I'm talking about truth, right? So determined to reject truth that they will believe something that isn't true and really believe it. Not that they're just, speaking lies, but they're speaking things they believe to be true. I'm kind of the view that we're there. That's my view. But how did we get here? Because people can't handle the truth, because people do not receive the love of the truth. That's a very interesting way of putting it, the love of the truth. So I'm going to recommend that not receiving the love of the truth includes, when you and I are challenged by the truth, we're challenged to deny our own will and our own desires, right? Which sometimes means we have to overcome our natural senses. Because sometimes those senses, because they're attached to this carnal, corruptible flesh, sometimes those senses can lie. Sometimes those senses will convince us of something that really isn't so. And so then we are reminded of the importance of hearing, seeing, experiencing by the Spirit of God, as opposed to hearing and seeing and observing by our soulish man. And there is a difference. Again, Messiah would say repeatedly, he who has an ear, let him hear. Meaning that dependent on the condition of that person's heart, they might hear things that were not said. They might hear things that are not so. They may see things that are not so. And then when we hear what wasn't said and we see what isn't true, it is our tendency to open up our mouth. I just want to see the sign again. And flap our gums. There you go. A little inside story. We were talking the other day, and I said that, and Christine was showing me how they sometimes will say, while they're signing, that they'll make that sign. And so she was telling me, don't think that I'm just saying that you're flapping your gums, but right now I am, so I better get back on. In their emotional In their emotional state of mind, their tongue uttered things that should have never been said. They said things they should have never said. Like, wouldn't it be better for us to return to Egypt? Let's select a different leader and return to Egypt. In verse 32 of chapter 13, they said this: the land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants. That was their perception of the land that God had promised to them and told them to possess. It's a land that devours its inhabitants. And in saying this, they slandered the land. But more importantly, they slandered the God that had promised them the land. In slandering God, basically what they were saying is God lied. And that's really what they were saying. God lied. Moreover, he's not able to bring us into the land. He's not able to finish what he has started. That's what they were saying. Worded it differently, but that is the essence of their message. And here's God's response, chapter 14, verse 22. These men who have seen my glory and the signs which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have put me to the test now these 10 times, and have not heeded my voice. They're not listening to me. They certainly shall not see the land of which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who rejected me see it. It is a serious matter as to how we receive the word of the Lord, how we perceive things, how we handle different matters. It's very, very important. So, as I'm reading through the Torah portion, thinking about this, about what to say, what to share. I mean, every year we go through the Torah portions, and some are a bit challenging as to what can I say that I haven't already said. I've kind of resigned myself to the fact that we're probably going to say things again and again and again and again. And why? Because Yeshua would say, and again I say unto you. God would say again and again and again. So apparently he feels we need to hear this again and again. But as I'm thinking about this, I'm reminded of the proverb that says, even a fool is counted wise when he holds his peace. Here's the way I put it. When I don't want a fly to get in my mouth, I keep it shut. If I don't know, I don't know, right? But when our emotions are ramped up because of our perceptions of things, it's very important that we're slow to speak, because there are some things that we've let out of our mouths that should have never left. So let's be reminded of what James had to say on the matter. Chapter 1, verse 26. If anyone among you thinks he's religious, I'm going to use this word if you don't mind, spiritual. If anyone among you thinks he is spiritual and does not bridle his tongue, but he deceives his own heart, this person's religion is useless. Now, what does the word useless mean? It's good for nothing. It's good for nothing. So think about how important that is. With all of our spiritual posturing and doing this and not doing that to present a life that looks spiritual, James says, if we do all of that and we can't keep our mouth shut when we need to keep our mouth shut, all of that other stuff is pointless. It doesn't matter how spiritual I might present myself. If I can't keep my mouth shut when I should keep my mouth shut, caveat, there are times to open your mouth. There are times to speak, yes. But you know what I'm talking about. If I can't keep my mouth shut when I need to keep my mouth shut, then I'm not very spiritual at all. I'm still very carnal. Now, aren't I? I'll wait. I hope I'm not making any enemies, Jerry. James chapter 3, verse 3. We put bits in horses' mouths that they may obey us. And we turn their whole body. Look also at ships. Although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. Even so, the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature. And it is set on fire by hell. Strong words. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea, it is tamed, and has been tamed by mankind. But no man can tame the tongue. That to me was just, I read it 100 zillion times, but today that just kind of jumped out at me. We have been able to send men to the moon. I know that some of you don't believe that, but I do. All right? We've been able to do all these wonderful things, but it still stands true that no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceeds blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. Amen. These things should not be. So, my gleanings today are, from this Torah portion, we see how important it is not to be led by our carnal senses to the point that we allow them to override what we know God has said. We don't need to stop our ears to the truth. Even if it hurts, we need to embrace it. And we don't need to consider someone an enemy because they tell you the truth. And likewise, we don't need to be the person who becomes an enemy to that person that tells us the truth. All right? Nor should we be intimidated by the possibility that someone will become our enemy if we speak and live the truth. So here are a few other takeaways I want to address before I close from this portion. Unbelief, discontent, rebellion, all those things, it affects the body at large. When they slandered the land and brought back the evil report, that evil report infected almost the entire congregation. But that slander affected everybody. I want to say that again. The evil report infected many, but it affected everybody. So the choices that are made by a majority of the congregation, this portion, in defiance of what God had said, caused the entire congregation to suffer the consequences. Everybody else had to wander the wilderness for an additional 38 years. The spies, who were leaders among the people, by the way, pointed out the negative instead of accentuating the positive. And as a result, the people of God lost faith in God. They lost the willingness to go in and to fight for the land, their purpose, the destiny, because possessing the land was their destiny. That was their purpose. Israel was not called to wander the wilderness for 40 years. That was not their call. Wandering the wilderness for 40 years was the consequence of not answering their call, refusing to function in their purpose, because without purpose, there is no point. If we're not functioning in our purpose individually, corporately, there's really no purpose. There's no life. We're only existing. We're here for a reason. Israel was not called to wander for 40 years. Again, that was the consequence of not answering the call. What happens to fig trees that don't produce figs? They're cursed, right? They dry up from the root, right? Or, in the parable in Luke, they get uprooted to make room for a fig tree that will produce some figs, right? Salt that isn't salty, what happens to it? It's tossed out in the street and trampled underfoot, under the heel of presumably your adversary. So when they refused to go into the land, this was a turning point. And the conquest of the land was delayed for 38 years because a majority of the people perceived things wrongly, saw things that did not happen or weren't reality for them, heard things that were never seen, these kinds of things. It delayed the conquest of the land for 38 years because the guilty were destined to die in the wilderness. So we would all do well to remember what Paul said in 1 Corinthians, and I'll paraphrase. Take stock of what these guys did and the mistakes they made, because these were written down for you and I, upon whom the ends of the age have come, as an example, meaning learn from their mistakes. And what should we learn from their mistakes? Not repeat their mistakes. But Paul wouldn't tell us that if it weren't possible for us to do the very same thing. So he's saying, don't do that. Don't repeat the mistakes of the past. Specifically, we should not perceive and report things in the manner demonstrated by the 10 spies. Looking at the negative, not remembering or holding on to what God has said. So we should not perceive things, we should not report things in the same way we see the 10 spies doing it. And if we are presented with such a report, you and I should not give ear to it. We should stop up our ears to things that we know are not true because God has said otherwise. It tells us that the people, the congregation of Israel, we have been discouraged by our brethren. It's one thing to be discouraged by the world, but I expect it of the world. It is another matter entirely to be discouraged by our brethren. That should not be. We should not be discouraging one another. We should not, even if we have doubt and uncertainty, we should not be discouraging someone else because of our doubt and uncertainty. Because when we discourage someone, we steal their courage. We take what courage they had away from them when we discourage them. And that's probably because we don't possess the courage in the first place. And so misery loves company, right? It should not be that way in the people of God. On the other hand, you and I are called to encourage one another. And if we encourage someone, what are we doing? We are giving them courage to do what we have been called to do. And if we are giving someone the courage to do those things, that means we possess the courage to do those things in the first place. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what distinguished Caleb from all the other spies, because he had a different spirit within him. When all these people are murmuring and rebelling, he's the one standing up and trying to silence the crowd and say, no, our God has told us this. This is truth. So then we need to be those kinds of people, encouraging one another, not discouraging one another. Remembering that as a congregation, even as it is with individuals and families, as a congregation, we have a purpose. There's a reason for this assembly. And we're not just to be something that just exists. There's a purpose to function in. And if we've been called, then there is a God-ordained purpose that we are expected to fulfill. And when we see things that seem to be one way, we should not disavow or disregard what we know God has already told us. We need to be led by the Spirit of God and not our carnal senses. We shouldn't become those kind of people who instill fear and doubt in other people. We need to encourage, not discouraged. Because, again, if we're going about and our doubt and uncertainty is discouraging us and we're discouraging others, then basically we've become the 10 spies. And if you read the Torah portion, it didn't turn out well for those guys. Not at all. So taking all of this into consideration, I'm going to conclude with this. And that is that at times our senses are going to fail us. I'm glad that I can smell most of the time, unless I walk into Alan's room at certain times of the day. I'm just playing. I'm glad that the Father gave us these senses because they serve us well. However, if we aren't careful, we can't allow those senses to fail us. I'm all for common sense. I believe that we live in a day when common sense isn't so common. I've seen that around town for many times, and it's a truth. But you know what? Even more than common sense, we need spiritual sensitivity. We need to be sensitive to the voice of God, and not hear in our spirit, in our heart, to hear His voice. Because quite honestly, well, I'll just use myself as the example. When I feel like the Spirit of God is telling me something, my first reaction is, I don't want to do that. When I feel like the Spirit of God is saying, I want you to say this, my first reaction is, I don't want to say that. Because that means I'm going to crawl out on a limb here, and I'm going to say something, and that always kind of scares me a little bit. Nevertheless, we need to be sensitive to the voice of God. And sometimes that will be in conflict with our common sense. Because common doesn't necessarily mean holy, right? Common doesn't necessarily mean holy. So in that vein of thought, I'm going to close with this passage, which I believe describes what we are not to be, and at the same time describes what we are to be. When Yeshua was asked, why do you teach in parables? He said this, Matthew chapter 13. I speak to them in parables because seeing they do not see. Hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. And in them the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled, which says, hearing you will hear and shall not understand, and seeing you will see and not perceive. Why? For the hearts of this people have grown dull. And so there it is. Whether we hear what he actually says or what we think he says, whether we see what he's actually doing or what we think we see, is dependent on the condition of our heart. And if our heart has become dull, we'll hear the words, but we won't hear the message. We'll see the events, but we won't perceive what he's really doing if our hearts have become dull. And so what is the remedy to make sure that our hearts do not become dull? Because lawlessness will abound, the hearts of many will grow cold, which is just another way of saying have grown dull. Would you agree with me that lawlessness abounds in these day and times? And what can happen, it seems to me anyway, as we see this lawlessness abounding and being so pervasive in culture today, and we don't see God doing what we would do if we were God. Let's just be honest. If I were God, I would thin the herd, okay? I would. I know I would. I mean, like that. And that's why I'm not God, right? But when we see that happening and then God not responding in the way we think he should because we can't observe it and perceive it right now, there's the potential for our love for him to grow cold. The hearts of this people have grown dull. You think about when Messiah is saying this. It's been with his ministry and John's ministry that preceded that, it had been about 400 years since there had been a direct word from God. And in that 400 years, a lot of things can happen. And when he's saying this, the people of God are under the heel of the Roman Empire. What I'm trying to suggest is all the conditions were right for the heart of his people to grow dull. And when they grow dull, because they're so overwhelmed with all the other stuff that's going on. By the way, we sang we're not going to be overwhelmed, right? If we sang it, let's mean it, right? And I'm talking to myself too. But anyway, if we allow those things to overwhelm us, those things can dull our heart. And when our hearts are dull, what happens? We can't hear what he's saying. We can't see what he's doing. And so the remedy, of course, again, is we should not allow our hearts to become dull. Their ears are hard of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, lest they should understand with their hearts and turn, so that I should heal them. But then this is what I wanted us to kind of end on. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. I want our eyes and ears to see and to hear what the Father is doing and saying, right? I know you do as well. But it is incumbent upon us to make certain that we live a life and pursue him in such a way that we do not allow our hearts to become overwhelmed and become dull and insensitive and calloused to what he's saying, but to remain sensitive to his voice. And when he speaks to me, maybe you find this is true as well, when he speaks to me, it's typically not to soothe my flesh. It's typically not to soothe my carnal desires and tendencies. Usually when he speaks to me, I can almost always know it's him because I don't want to do it. Amen?